It goes like this. Ned and Robb Stark, in the eyes of fandom, journalists, and even George R.R. Martin, died from having too much honour and making stupid mistakes. Whilst it is true Robb and Ned made significant errors in judgment, the portrayal of honour is a bit off in Game of Thrones. Honour doesn't make you weak, naive, or foolish. So often, acting honourably requires strength and deep awareness of knowing why it's necessary. This point was forgotten while Game of Thrones went on. There seemed to be this presumption in fans and journalists that medieval honour and chivalry were all lies and meant nothing under the pointy end of a stick. The success and survival of characters like Bronn speak to the skepticism modern audiences have towards chivalry and honour. Here, I will argue that Ned did not die from honour or any chivalric principle. Rather, he died from underestimating the evil of Littlefinger, Cersei, and Joffrey. I'll also offer a defence of honour by analysing key literature and historical events from medieval Europe. More importantly, I want us to reconsider medieval honour as a positive rather than a negative that gets good men killed. Yet, there's always room for nuance, and I will not portray late medieval honour as a solely positive thing without any flaws. I'm Madeleine Rose Jones, and I study history, literature, and culture. Welcome to Snowy Fictions. Part 1. Understanding Honour. Every discussion on honour requires a clear understanding of what it is, and this can be hard. Throughout Western history, societies, empires, and individuals have perceived honour differently. Honour meant something different in ancient Greece than after the French Revolution. These conceptions of honour may differ from Eastern ideas, especially the ones found in China and Japan. Our ideas of honour are also influenced by trends in philosophy, warfare, culture, and theology. This is clear in the 19th century, where Romanticism emphasized a chivalric code which indicated an almost radical development from the late Middle Ages. You only have to see a Pre-Raphaelite painting or read Sir Walter Scott to know what I mean. However, I want you to see honour as an evolving, ever-changing ideal. There's a danger in overstating the differences between time periods in the West. For example, many of us associate honour with virtue. To be honourable, after all, is to be a good person. This mode of thinking is consistent throughout Western history, from ancient Rome to the Middle Ages, all the way to the Iraq War and the emergence of NATO. So, whilst I stress the intellectual diversity of the West, there are core strains present in understanding honour. In addition, honour never existed in isolation. To understand honour, you have to know the role and importance of the military, as well as intellectual and religious history. Honour is a small piece of the overall medieval worldview. There is also Christianity, the Latin language, chivalry, scholasticism, growing neoclassicism, and a distinctive role for nobility, clergy, and artists. You must consider human nature. Most men and women will not live up to the lofty ideas present in chivalric romance. The late medieval historian of France, Professor Craig Taylor, at the University of York, has highlighted this inconsistency. After all, late medieval history in England and France was gruesome and hostile. Medieval knights also engaged in rivalry with one another, Honour was an extension of this, as were the desires for fame and glory. Your average medieval knight was greatly concerned with his status among other knights and thus felt a strong motivation towards honour. Whilst an unfashionable word these days, shame was also present. If you didn't fulfill the criteria of being honourable, you were bringing shame upon yourself and therefore judgment. We should see honour as part of the overall medieval worldview. You can find manuscripts, poetry, stories, letters, and hagiographies which emphasize at least chivalry, if not honour. The most obvious example is the Arthurian legend, where medieval knights were represented as part of a larger mythos, that of Camelot. However, we also have the literature of Christine de Pizan and Gilles de Rome, both who used storytelling and narrative to illuminate values of good rulership, chivalry, and Aristotelian thought into their readers, which consisted of boys and young men. Women were also included in this wider sphere of chivalry and honour, too, but with a difference. The incredible tapestry, called The Lady and the Unicorn, was commissioned by the La Vista family in the late Middle Ages and portrays an idealized and soft form of femininity that is meant to inspire their daughters. This is a crucial point of the Middle Ages. Men and women saw themselves represented in a variety of literatures, but especially Arthurian romance and chivalric literatures. Camelot, after all, is an extension of Britain. Henceforth, I urge you to see late medieval honour as an ideal, a worldview, and a shared culture between nobility. Whilst it's easy to dismiss medieval individuals as not being honourable, it's not that they didn't care or think about honour. We can see that honour shaped the lives of kings, princes, artists, knights and monks, whether on the battlefield, in the throne room, or at court. Usually in our contemporary age, people sneer at honour as beneath them and not worth anything. Yet, as Professor Craig Taylor points out, honour and chivalry helped organise medieval society to some extent and may have helped diffuse tensions between aristocrats and nobility. That's certainly a positive aspect of honour, and one more critics ought to keep in mind. In addition, honourable people can possess strength while having lived tragic lives. I find Anglo-Saxon literature a fascinating example of this, especially the poetry present in the Exeter book. In The Wanderer, we really get an insight into the mourning and loss present in early medieval England, but we also understand the intellectual breadth and maturity of these individuals in the writings of saints and St. Bede and the retellings of biblical stories. Even in A Song of Ice and Fire, Eddard Stark is an honourable man who lived a tragic life. His brother and father were killed by the Mad King, whilst his sister, Lyanna Stark, died near the end of Robert's rebellion at a very young age. Ned was also aware of the suffering inflicted onto others, as seen in his disgust towards Elia Martell and her children's brutal murders, as well as Tywin Lannister's sack of King's Landing. All of this challenges the idea that honour makes you stupid or naive. Rather, honourable men and women in both Game of Thrones and the Middle Ages knew they lived among evil and great brutality. That's why it is important to stress honour as an ideal, something to live up to, as opposed to a literal observation about human nature. Yet, honour can kill. especially when it is held as a supreme value. In Season 7 of Game of Thrones, the Tarleys die because neither Randall nor Dickon will bend the knee to Daenerys. There are many reasons for this, of course. For one, both find the notion of submitting to Dany to be disgusting, and their allegiances are already to Cersei, who in their minds is the rightful queen of Westeros. Beyond this, one can argue that standing by your principles, not giving in to your enemy, and dying without crouching or begging is a form of honour. Because of this, it's important to not imply that having honour will protect you from harm and that it can never be turned against you. Likewise, late medieval history gives us many examples of honourable individuals getting killed, such as St. Joan of Arc. Honour may not have specifically killed her, but it is fair to say that being honourable and courageous is particularly challenging throughout history, and this is particularly true in medieval settings. The late Middle Ages also had a stigma against surrendering and stressed the importance of kings and princes fighting. All was part of the wider worldview on honour, which could mean, of course, that honourable individuals may die. Part 2. What did kill Ned Stark? Honour didn't kill Ned Stark. Whilst I've defended medieval honour, I will concede that some aspects of honour, when taken to black and white extremes, can lead to someone's death. We can also rule out other factors leading to Ned's execution. Some fans exaggerate the role Sansa played in telling Cersei about the plans of leaving King's Landing. Others hyper-focus on Catelyn Stark too. Yet, they were ultimately pawns to the big three decision makers at King's Landing: Joffrey Baratheon, Cersei Lannister, and Peter Baelish. Ned knew they were evil and not to be trusted, and this is established quite early in the show. But why did Ned die? What mistakes led him to Baelor, where he was executed in front of his two daughters? Here, I'll put forward my thesis. Ned Stark died from underestimating those around him and the vicious circumstances set in King's Landing. For one, he is clueless about Littlefinger's control over Lysa Arryn, who ultimately murders her husband Jon at the beginning of the first book. And there's good reason for Ned to never suspect Lysa. She was a reclusive woman, Catelyn's estranged sister, and away in the Vale. Nor does Ned connect the dots between Littlefinger and Lysa. To Ned, Littlefinger didn't exist in the same realm as Lysa, as he wasn't from a noble family, and although very much connected to the Vale and the childhood of the Tullys, he was a brothel owner in King's Landing and kept his ambitions hidden well. Much to Ned's error, he was warned quite often about Littlefinger. He just couldn't put the pieces together. None of this has to do with honour. In fact, Ned somewhat breaks honour by telling Cersei, thus betraying his king's trust, and later not telling Robert Baratheon on his deathbed about his children not being his. These choices may be morally justified, but they aren't honourable. Throughout time, we conflate honour with moral virtue, yet the case of Ned Stark shows the need for more nuance between these two categories. Game of Thrones somewhat indicates an understanding through Stannis Baratheon, who is honourable and keeps to his word, but isn't necessarily a moral person. Ultimately, Joffrey is responsible for giving the order to Ilyn Payne, and Cersei and Littlefinger are responsible for their choices too. It's not so much Ned is so stupid and he caused his own death, but that the very human trait of underestimating your opponents caused this already bad situation to worsen. There is something so unpredictable and unhinged about Littlefinger. Cersei, Joffrey, and by extension, Lysa Arryn, that I'm not sure Ned ever really stood a chance in King's Landing. Part 3. Why the Myth? Unfortunately, both George R.R. Martin and the Game of Thrones writers seem to possess a very contemporary worldview, which can sometimes sneer at the past, especially the Middle Ages, and see modernity as above concepts like chivalry and honour. This is certainly part of our postmodern age, one grim dark fiction was more than happy to adapt, where individuals feel satisfied in tramping and ridiculing previous generations. The Middle Ages does look poorly in retrospect, but at times this isn't a fair reading. However, there is no denying George R.R. Martin's interest in the Middle Ages. While skeptical about medieval chivalry and honour, I don't see him as enemy number one of it. He is capable of writing nuanced characters who are tested, like Brienne of Tarth. There's also the possibility of redemption being offered to Sandor Clegane and Jaime Lannister. I also appreciate the many opportunities given to characters like Sansa Stark to maintain their honour and goodness as the story progresses. So, whilst George R.R. Martin and the Game of Thrones TV show present a sort of simplistic view on honour and medieval values, the characters themselves are complex individuals who are rightly cherished by fans. In addition, there are valid criticisms of medieval ideas and culture. For example, medieval honour and chivalry could be performative at times, where knights would act a certain way in the courts, but completely different in the battlefields. The historian I mentioned earlier, Professor Craig Taylor, has discussed this in length. And let's not pretend medieval knights were above rivalry and being competitive with each other. Of course, these were human beings, not angels. The problem is that the portrayal of honour in Game of Thrones lacks the nuance many of us crave and is sadly built on a few misconceptions about that time. Another stirring point, which I may discuss in a future video, is the chivalry espoused in the modern era, especially from the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. Whilst very much engaged with Arthurian literature and the concepts of the Middle Ages, the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood espoused a slightly different form of chivalry, which to me was far more naive and simplistic, but again, another video for another time. What are your thoughts on medieval honour and chivalry? Are they well depicted in both A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones? Make sure to leave a comment. I'd love to read your thoughts. And if you'd like, please subscribe for more videos about history, literature, and culture. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you soon.